with the second talk. We are privileged to have Kees from Google, who is one of the lead contributors to Kernel Security.
Locations.
Talk to us this morning about the state of kernel self-protection.
Ik schiet op jou, of niet?
Hi, thanks.
Sta jij daar?
I've been told I should project, so I'll do that. As mentioned, it's my name is spelled funny, but it's just pronounced Kees. It's the Dutch spelling.
Oh, ik bestuur hem.
I
dat is lastig.
blame my parents because they named me after my grandfather, but this works. If you want to follow along, I have some links in some places, in some of the examples. That's the URL to the PDF of these slides. This presentation is about the Linux kernel. Much of what I have to say at the beginning sort of applies to other software in the whole software ecosystem, though. There's sort of a rough agenda of what I'm going to cover, some of the background and justification for the self-protection project and why I feel passionately about this, and then a little bit about who we are, the bug classes and exploits we're trying to kill, and how you can help if you're interested. When I'm talking about kernel security for this talk, it's more than just access control or attack surface reduction or bug fixing or protecting user space, and more than just kernel integrity. These are all topics in general kernel security, but this is specifically about kernel self-protection, the kernel trying to defend itself from attack. And the reason for this, I don't need to really drive this home, but everything is using Linux. There's 2 billion active Android devices. Now, the downside of this, of course, is the majority are running a 3.10 kernel. Slowly, 3.18 is catching up. Last year, this was like 3.4 and 3.10, so that's nice. We're moving forward in time. That's good. But the issue is that bug lifetimes on these kinds of devices are even longer than the bug lifetimes that exist in Upstream. And sort of talking about the lifetime being when it was introduced and when something was solved. And there tends to be a lot of attitude in the Upstream kernel society about this is not our problem. They're running such an old kernel. They should use the latest kernel. It's like, OK, fine, but they are still running the Linux kernel. How do we get to a place where even if you're on an old kernel, you're at least somewhat defended? Because it's hard to get those bug fixes all the way back to these old devices. It would be nice for all of our phones to be running the latest kernel, but we're not there yet. That's a whole other topic. So looking at Upstream bug lifetime, John Corbett looked at this in 2010 and spent the time to research, when was a CVE, a CVE flaw introduced and when it was fixed, and figure out the lifetime for those bugs. And this is the opportunity an attacker has, basically, between when it was introduced and when it was fixed. I did this again. I keep doing this every time I give this presentation, looking at the Ubuntu CVE tracker. Their kernel team does a pretty good job of doing that same research and looking back to see when a flaw was introduced, and then obviously when it was fixed. And so the numbers here are sort of beginning to creep up to 6 years on average. And I can show soon why that is. But really, we've only had about 3 critical bugs, but their lifetime is huge. They were introduced, and then 5 years later, we went, oh, let's fix that. Last time I gave this talk, I told people, hey, all of your machines have a critical bug, and we don't know what it is yet. Turns out that was Meltdown Inspector, but that turns out to be a hardware issue, so I'm not including that in my count of software flaws, but still, there's very likely a software flaw right now on all your devices, and we just don't know what it is yet. So it'd be nice to try to contain the effect of that flaw. So this unreadable graph is CVE lifetime. So every vertical line is a lifetime of a single CVE from when it was introduced at the bottom to when it was fixed at the top. So time is up and down. You can see the kernel releases in very small text on the side. And then so red, which you can barely see, are the critical ones. And then orange was sort of high, medium, and low. And really, let's only pay attention to the critical and high lifetimes. The long red one there, it was the dirty cow, and that really brought the average up. But you can see it's starting at the right side. It's actually we're starting to see the lifetimes lifting up out of pre-Git history. So I was concerned for a while that the average was going to be growing forever, because the average was just going to be, well, it was introduced before Git history, and now it's further along in time from Git history, so the average will just keep getting bigger. We've actually started to see the tail of these coming to lift up out of pre-Git history, so I'm hoping that maybe we'll stabilize this average to 6 years so that we can start reducing it to have our bug lifetimes be even smaller. And that's mostly about detecting bugs and finding and fixing them. Some people will come to me and say, sure, big deal, there was a 5-year bug lifetime, but no one knew about it. They couldn't use it. An attacker didn't find those bugs. I say, well, no, this risk isn't theoretical. We have evidence that attackers are watching the Linux kernel commits, and they tend to be better at finding bugs than we are at finding them. We've had times when they come out in public and say, you know, haha, we found this as soon as we committed and we've been using it for the last 5 years or whatever. But most attackers are not going to be publicly boasting about this. It's important to think that it's not theoretical. There is a real thing here. So fighting bugs is good. We are finding them. I think the graphs sort of show evidence of our use of all the static checkers and the dynamic checkers. We're fixing them. There's thousands of fixes going into the stable branches. I think when I looked somewhat recently in the 4.9.49 stable release at the time, there were almost 3,600 patches, which turned out to be about 73 bug fixes per stable release number. So it's very clear we're pulling in lots of bug fixes. The problem is, of course, they're always going to be around, and they exist whether or not we are aware of them or believe in them. Whack-a-mole isn't a solution. It definitely helps us reduce the number, but we're still going to have, and we're going to keep introducing bugs. So a wonderful analogy was given in the 2015 Linux Security Summit by the lead admin for kernel.org, where he talks about the 1960s car industry and how there was all this advertising on, it's amazing how well it runs. You drive down the highway and you're not sprayed in the face with, you know, gas and coolant and whatever, and everything's great. But of course, at that time, if you blow a tire and run into a tree, everybody dies. Like, it just did not work. Like, it ran really well, but it did not fail very well. And so there was a lot of attention given to safety. And this is where we need to make those changes in our general software ecosystem and in the kernel in particular. And for the kernel in particular, since user space is becoming more and more difficult to attack, if you looked at Jesse Frizzell's keynote today, talking about locking down all kinds of stuff in user space with containers and isolation and all sorts of other confinement, this starts to paint a huge target on the kernel itself, because you must expose some interfaces to the kernel, otherwise you can't get anything done. So, you know, getting into the kernel and making attacks against it is becoming significantly more interesting to attackers. And I don't want to terribly scare anyone, but it isn't hyperbolic to say that lives depend on Linux. Like, for example, the 2014 Futex kernel bug was used to root Android devices, but that eventually got co-opted by the hacking team who sold weapons to oppressive regimes and used that to target their dissidents and families. Like, this actually affects people's lives, potentially. That's why I tend to feel pretty passionate about making sure we protect stuff as well as we can. And I want to get Linux caught up. I want this to look like this comparison of, it's a 2009 on the right Chevy Malibu versus a 1959 Bel Air crash test. And the 1959 cabin is just completely smashed. There's nothing left in there. And 2009, the cabin is mostly uncompressed. It's a terrible accident, but the crash test dummy is surviving that one, but not so much in the other car. So I'd like to do the same thing for Linux in specific, but the rest of the ecosystem generally. So killing bugs is nice. Linus Torvalds has a famous quote effectively saying, all security bugs are just normal bugs. And there is some truth to that statement. Your security bug may not be my security bug, your just bug might be my critical security bug, et cetera. And given the variety of bugs available, we don't have a lot of idea of what attackers are going to be using at any given moment. And bugs might be in out-of-tree code, not in the main upstream kernel. Some on upstream vendor drivers, for example. And again, this is where a lot of the kernel community tends to say, oh, but it's not our problem, it's in out-of-tree code. It's like, well, sure, but you're providing the infrastructure that that code runs on. Can't we do something to make it harder for people to shoot themselves in the foot to have those bugs exposed in the first place? So I'd rather us kill entire bug classes. Then they can't happen again. Not even out-of-tree code can hit them. But we'll never kill all bug classes. That's fine. We can, however, kill exploitation methods. So if we can eliminate the exploitation targets that are used in the kernel, if we can eliminate methods that attackers use to gain a foothold, eliminate information leaks, basically anything that assists an attacker, get rid of it. Make it as an inhospitable environment as possible. And the tweak on this, of course, is that we want to do this even if it makes development more difficult. And this has been a huge pushback where you say, but you're adding so much complexity to the kernel. I don't want to have to deal with that. There's a lot of pushback on this, which isn't an unreasonable argument, but it needs to be weighed against the protection that it provides. You've got, for example, going back to the car analogy, you've got a car designer who's trying to, I want the lines of the exterior of this vehicle to look like this, and I want the window to be, really big over here, and the guy in charge of, whoever's in charge of the door design is like, well, no, we've got to have a titanium bar here, so when it gets hit on the side, we don't get crushed. And the designer kind of goes, I got to work around this. But they're working around the safety concerns for that situation. So what's nice is it's rare to have a single bug result in a viable exploit. Most attacks are built out of a chain of bugs, so anything we can do to break that chain of finding a target, injecting code, locating that code, and running it. Like anything, there are going to be methods and bugs to use to build this whole chain of attack. Anything we can do to break that helps us. So that's another way of stopping the exploitation. So what can we do about it? We already have defenses that exist in the world, and there's a growing concern about improving kernel security, so much so that the Washington Post wrote up an article on this. We've got techniques that exist in, for example, GR security and PACS, which have tons of stuff. There's research stuff in academic white papers, like the PTI patches recently for Meltdown came out of academic research. And a lot of those things haven't ended up in the upstream Linux kernel for a variety of reasons. So after the Washington Post article, it seemed like it was the right time to really try to push this forward and say there's enough people that I can't do it all alone, but if there's enough people interested in this and we can get everyone together and sort of share our ideas and work together and test things and develop stuff and work on it, we might be successful. But speaking briefly about out-of-tree defenses, this is what a lot of people have gone to since they didn't, you can only do so much as an engineering group on a kernel that you're using. So some downstream kernel forks that have defenses. For example, technically, Red Hat's kernel is a fork of the upstream Linux kernel. They had for a while an exec shield series of patches that improved defenses. Ubuntu tends to develop their AppArmor defenses in Ubuntu first, and then upstream it, and that's a fork. It's a distro fork. All distros are a fork, except for like 2. Android has, the Samsung Knox has some significant changes to the kernel as well to provide some defenses. Then of course, like the granddaddy of them all is GR Security, which has tons and tons of stuff that they developed as a defense. But all of this is out of tree from a certain perspective. Now, if you're only using the kernel, let's say you're a web host and you just need a kernel to run and provide you with user space, it's much easier to run a fork because you're in a better position. You don't have to make changes on your own. However, if you're developing the kernel for specific purposes, you're a phone vendor or you run a production service that needs changes to how the kernel works, it's really hard to try to integrate multiple forks. You've got your own fork of things that you want to do, and bringing in other forks tends to be incredibly painful, and your engineering staff may be limited. So really, putting stuff into Upstream is the only way for everyone to get it, and really roll this out to the whole world. You know, in my early slide where I'm talking about Linux being everywhere. So just a quick digression first, totally changing the subject. Defending against email spam. So I'll get to a good point here, I swear. So the client connects, the server accepts that and sends a banner, and we go back and forth with email protocol, a line at a time, sort of getting through communication. This is normal way to do it. There is a class of spam bots that they just connect, and the server accepts it and sends a banner, and then they just dump everything at it without even waiting to see. And then the server sort of processes it a line at a time anyway, and says, oh, hi, okay, yeah, sure, and takes your spam. There's a trivial solution to this, which is inserting a short delay between connecting and sending a banner. The client connects, the server accepts and waits, and the client dumps everything because it's a spam bot. And then the server goes, oh, you were talking before the banner arrived. You're not even remotely speaking the correct protocol. Drop the connection. I'm not going to talk to you. And like whatever you do first for spam defenses will catch 90% of the spam. So here it is with a virtually no CPU effort. You can drop all of your spam because lots of spam bots are not paying any attention to the actual protocol. That's nice, it's powerful because it's not the default. Bots, if everyone did this, bots would adapt, but they'd be forced to actually implement proper SMTP stacks to get it done, so it sort of drives things up a bit as far as the difficulty. But if you have a defense that's in a fork, that's unexamined or only run by a small subset of users, those people gain the protections, but sometimes they haven't been looked at by any researchers. You're not certain that they provide the defense that they claim to provide. But on the flip side, having a mixed environment does give you some additional resilience. But the point is to get stuff actually in. So to illustrate this, my second digression, Stack Clash in 2017. So a lot of the underlying issues for the Stack Clash vulnerability were identified 7 years prior. The idea being that if you can control the memory layout of a process, you may be able to manipulate things and crash your stack into other things and gain control over setuid processes to elevate your privileges. So in 2010, this was examined and looked at, and the Linux kernel folks said, we'll add like a one-page gap between heap and stack, and we'll be good. In GR Security, from 2010 until their last public patch, took it further, and they said, we're uncomfortable with only 4K. I think this should be a lot bigger. We're not sure, but it feels like there's more problems here. They were correct. So they defaulted to 64K, but you could blow it a whole bunch. It turns out the gap was not enough. This is a snippet of the code responsible for them. An additional piece was that they lowered the size of the stack that was allowed for setuid processes. So that they had this gap, but they're saying, well, if you're going to try to run a setuid process, let's stop you from being able to manipulate stack sizes and do all sorts of crazy things that change the layout. You shouldn't be able to do that either. So they added additional protections. And it turns out this was incredibly effective against Stack Clash because you couldn't manipulate the stack. This worked very well. They were correctly paranoid to think of that. Upstreaming that fix, that like 4 lines or whatever, took 9 people, 15 patches, landed in 4.14, still wasn't complete because it only handled 1 of 2 cases where this could be bypassed. And the fixes for the second problem are on the way. But what wasn't considered at the time in GR Security's solution was that the stack limit can be changed from outside the process that is execing. So you can start a bunch of threads, and the other thread will start to exec, and then you just keep manipulating the stack until you bypass it. And sure enough, you could do this even on a now old GR Security system. They found another way to bypass a protection that was put in Upstream that was pointed out by Upstream people, but we missed it. So it was still unexamined, but we actually went back and forth to find a proper solution to this. The point being that out-of-tree defenses really need to be upstreamed. Without that back and forth, without the open development, without actually getting it in, you end up in situations where you have kind of a maybe defense. It probably works, but have we really looked at it? Has it been widely deployed and shown to actually be what it says it is? So again, this isn't universally true, but it sort of illustrates why some tiny change sometimes requires way more work to actually get into upstream. So how do we do this? And that was the end of 2015. After that Washington Post article, I said, all right, let's get together. I posted to the kernel hardening mailing list that was pre-existing and started up the kernel self-protection project and said, anyone interested in coding, testing, documenting, discussing, whatever, let's get together and try to get this done. So these numbers are a little hard to count. I sort of hand wave it, but there are a lot of other people also working on things that are about defending user space from user space, kernel-assisted user space defenses, brute force detection, a bunch of other things like that. The KSPP tends to focus on protecting the kernel from kernel attacks from user space rather than protecting user space. So there's about 12 organizations and maybe 10 individuals working on a ever-shifting set of technologies. It's slow and steady. It's not a revolution. It is an evolution. Standard comment. This is my eye chart of names. There's lots of other people on this mailing list, but I've been working on code and testing and design. I've probably forgotten some people, so please let me know if I failed to mention you or if you've moved between companies or anything else or spelled something wrong. But I really like to point out how many people have joined this in some capacity, and I'm hugely grateful to them because we need as much help as we can possibly get. It's a huge bit of work, which I'll now get into. Possibly another digression where I talk about two different types of protections, the classes, sort of the basic categories for these protections. So there's probabilistic protections. This is some secret that the attacker does not know. This is weaker than a deterministic protection, based on the naming even. Familiar examples are your password. If you share it with someone else, they have access to your stuff. Like, okay, it can be guessed, it can be brute forced, etc. This is a probabilistic protection. The stack protector is a canary value that is randomly created and is supposed to be secret, so an attacker can't use it. Address space layout randomization, the offset can be exposed. Again, it's just a probabilistic defense. It makes things more expensive to attack when you're trying to develop exploits. Better than that are deterministic protections, which is the state of some system that can't be changed. This, of course, assumes that the system is actually does what it says it does. So all my familiar examples here were ruined. Read-only memory, yeah, okay, fine, but Meltdown can't write to memory yet. We'll see. Bounds checking, except Spectre, but in normal world, read-only memory really is read-only. You can't, unless you flip it, if you shift it around, then maybe you can write to it. So that's a deterministic protection. And bounds checking, if you try to write past the end of an array, but you just checked how large the array is, like if the code is always checking, that's deterministic. You can't change that. So deterministic protections are, as these slides allude, somewhat more difficult to achieve. But that's the goal. So shifting now to bug classes. By far the most well understood is the stack buffer overflow. There's also stack exhaustion, where you run off the end of stack. The kernel stack is significantly smaller on x86-64. It's only 16K. Tends to be, doesn't need to be very big normally. But under certain circumstances, you could, in the past, exhaust the stack and do funny things on the other side. So there's a ton of different mitigations about different aspects here. And each of these I forgot to introduce. I'll usually have an exploit example just to try to illustrate some things and list a bunch of mitigations. Things that I've got in bold are stuff that are in Upstream, including what version it was applied, and stuff in italics are things that we're trying to work on right now. And everything else is just sort of notes and examples about where other implementations exist in the world, things like that that aren't yet in the Upstream kernel but are worth looking at. So we've had stack canaries for a long time, and we've improved them over time. Guard pages at the end of the stack, so for stack exhaustion, or you'd run off the end of the stack and fault because there's no page at the end of it. That was added pretty recently. And we've removed the delicate things that were at the bottom of the stack, moved them away so we can't overwrite them and do terrible things anymore. And we're going to continue with unbounded allocations with like alloc-a. That's being worked on. And then there's like the conceptual idea of shadow stacks where you can protect returns and other things, and the Clang safe stack exists for this as well. Another big bug class is integer overflow and underflow. One of the biggest places for this tended to be in reference counting in the kernel. Both of these examples are from 2016, so I tried to encourage people to spend some time on fixing this, and we ended up with a ref count overflow protection in 4.11, and we've been slowly converting the atomic counters that were used for reference counting into this protected reference counter now.